Is that okay? Did you want to? Is it okay? I was going to have to start like that. So these are the 6 candles for the Jewish victims, and then these are for the victims that I mentioned. If it's easier, not.
Oh my God.
That might be better. Do you want the students to line up? And so for the resistance, we're with him now. Are you ready? And this candle is for the Roma and the disabled victims. And for the victims of genocide since 1945, since World War II. So welcome to Wagner College's celebration and honoring of the memory of the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht in November 8th, 9th, and 10th of 1938. We're all here to honor the stories of Jews and others, but particularly the Jewish victims of Nazi tyranny. And we're here to ask ourselves, why did this happen? How did this happen, and why did this happen, and what role might we have in preventing something like this from ever happening again? So I want to first start by asking our fellow students, Wagner students who are interning at the museum, to come up and speak about their experience at the museum and ways in which you can play a role in remembering Kristallnacht and other parts of the Holocaust. Thank you, Anna and Julia.
Thank you. Okay, so my name is Julia. I'm a junior here at Wagner College, and my name is Anna, and I am a sophomore at Wagner. And this semester, we are interning at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Basically, it entails is a pre-visit tour and a post-visit. And basically, what that means is that for the pre-visit, you go to the school in which you get matched and paired with, and you talk to the students, give them a little introduction on what the museum is all about, how the museum is laid out. The first floor of the museum is Jewish life before the Holocaust and World War II. The second floor is about the Holocaust, and then the third floor is post-Holocaust life and how we can help other genocides and everything that is going on. And the name of the tour is Meeting Hate with Humanity, so we are trying to meet hate with how the responses and how to, what to do with it and everything in that matter. And
so it's essentially a museum education internship, and every
semester 16, they take 16 interns, and you do just go to schools and you teach with the overarching theme of what can we do about atrocities today, and talking about what happened during the Holocaust and kind of how to teach about something so horrific in a way that you produce positive responses and get people involved. So you do a training and you get to hear survivor testimonies and from people who lived during that time. And you also hear from survivors of other genocides. You learn a lot about the Darfur genocide. And so if you have any interest in any of this, we encourage you to apply. We have a list at the end. If you want to come talk to us, you can write your email down and your name, and you can get a little more information about how you can get involved and the application process. And we also have some flyers, so we'll be doing that after.
Yeah, and just explains more about the flyers if you're interested. Just explains more about the program and what it entails, the application process, and everything like that. If you're interested in museum education, history, art history, if you're in education and you want to interested in teaching, I definitely encourage you to apply. It's not religious affiliated, so if you're not Jewish, it is okay to apply. It's more of getting more of the background experience and learning more definitely about the Holocaust and World War II.
Even if it's a topic that just interests you. So.
Does anybody have any quick questions? I just wanted to ask if you could just mention one specific thing you've learned since starting the internship that you found particularly meaningful?
Definitely
or an object that really touched you?
Something that I've definitely learned that really touched me was what was going on in America during World War II. At beginning this internship, I was always fascinated with that idea. I didn't know what was going on here because I always thought if I was living in America during that time, I would definitely want to do something about what was going on in Europe. So I thought that was really interesting. They have a whole exhibit basically that touches on that and everything. All the letters that got sent over, just asking for help and all the help that they asked for, and slowly they got that help. But I thought that was definitely interesting what I learned of the museum.
When you go into the museum, it opens with remember, never forget, and remembering this lesson. And when the exhibition ends, it talks about Jewish life after and kind of what's being done by people now to help with other genocides, and I think that's to me, I feel like it's very valuable, and I always enjoy talking about it with students. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I hope some of you will be inspired both by their presentation and by Ms. Hanau's presentation to get more involved in remembering the tragedy of the Holocaust. So thank you.
Thank you.
Very well done. At the end, I'll tell you about some upcoming events at Wagner College. Right now, I wanted to just introduce you to say a few remarks to Professor Stephen Greenwald. He teaches both film studies, the business of film. He was once president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers. He's also taught in Israel, and he cares deeply about the topic of remembering the Holocaust. Professor Greenwald.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you all for being here, and I want to thank Laurie for organizing this, and I want to thank particularly Mrs. Hanau for joining us today. I was in Israel 2 weeks ago, and as I try to do when I go there, I visited Yad Vashem again, for Yad Vashem is the museum, the memorial to the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust. And it's unfathomable, of course, what happened. You can't wrap your mind around it in any real way. But you can forget, and we can't forget. We must not forget, because we heard just a minute ago about other kinds of...
Can you speak a little louder? They can't hear you in the
other
back.
kinds of similar atrocities that are happening today. And we also know that these kinds of phenomena do not disappear from the world. If you've read, any of you have read The Plague by Albert Camus, you know this allusion that he has at the end of the book where he talks about the plague hiding away. in a drawer somewhere and waiting to emerge again. And that's a very good metaphor for this kind of phenomenon of anti-Semitism or any kind of hatred and prejudice that then turns into these horrific events that we saw in this period and that people experienced, like Mrs. Hanau. And you'll hear about that. So we must mark these things. We must mark and remember. So I'm very pleased that this was organized here at Wagner. I hope we continue to do this sort of marking and remembering, because we must not forget. So I thank you all for being here, and thank the organizers.
Who are your class? Before I introduce the speaker, I just wanted to give a very fast introduction to some of the central issues of the Holocaust. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Professor Lori Weintraub. I'm chair of the history department, and I've been teaching about the Holocaust at Wagner since 1995, organizing often events with the Jewish community, the different synagogues and Jewish groups on Staten Island. So this is part of a long history of promoting Holocaust education. Often students, when they think of the Holocaust, what is the first thing you might think of when you think of the Holocaust? What's the first image or first idea you have when you think about the Holocaust?
Concentration camps.
Concentration camps. And one of the things that I like to really emphasize, I mean, concentration camps are obviously the most unique part, the most tragic part. The idea of, amassing human beings and putting them through a mass industrialization style process of, stripping them, shaving their hair, right, gassing them, sending them to work, killing them through starvation and disease and labor, right, are very horrific parts of the Holocaust. But things like that don't just happen, right? It took 10 years for the Nazis to come to power, to develop enough power within Germany, and to create a situation where the rest of the world did not intervene, right, for that to happen. And Kristallnacht is so important because it's the key milestone in the transition from economic and political persecution of Jews to actual acts of violence and terror, notably the arrest of the killing of 91 men, the burning of synagogues all over Germany, and the events that we're going to hear about from our guest speaker. How does this happen? How does something like this happen? I just want to point to 2 or 3 factors in how something like this can happen. Jews were only this is the next question. What percentage of Germany do you think were Jewish? Right, if you haven't yet looked at the slide, if you had to guess, right, what percentage of Germans were Jewish? Right? I could ask you the same thing for the United States today. What percentage of Americans are Jewish? Does anybody know for today in the United States about what percentage?
Well, I know in the world it's less than 1%. I'm not 100% sure.
For the United States? About 2%, right? And you can think about the visibility of Jewish Americans. In Germany, they were 1%, with another maybe about 500,000, and another 200,000 who were converted Jews, so Jews who practiced Christianity, but their parents or grandparents had been Jewish for different political and economic reasons they had converted. So altogether, barely 1.5% of Germans in any way identified as Jewish. That's a very small number. And yet, the Nazis managed to create a target through economic boycotts, through the Nuremberg laws in 1935, where they took away civil and political rights. They began to persecute Jews to try to get them to leave Germany, to emigrate from Germany. Right? This was the original platform. This was the original goal of the Nazis. And then they started to get more and more bold. Why did they get more and more bold? Already some of the Jews from Germany were leaving, but they also were getting bold in terms of their foreign policy. They annexed Austria. They annexed Czechoslovakia. The rest of the world had a few conversations. You might know the Munich conference, but there was no attempt to stop the Nazis. Roosevelt said, we see a refugee problem emerging, right? Let's have a conference where we can see who will take Jewish refugees, right, to save them from this horrible situation. How many countries agreed to take Jews in 1938, just months before Kristallnacht? Does anybody know? barely a country, right? The Dominican Republic agrees to take several hundred, and China agrees to take several hundred, and everybody else is saying, we're afraid immigrants will take our jobs, right? We don't want to get involved in a conflict in another country, right? Those two pieces allowing, within Germany, the elites that allowed economic and political persecution, and outside Germany, the world watching as political, military, and other kinds of persecution happened to the Jews. These are the factors that underlay the story that we're going to hear about when economic and political persecution begins to take a more violent turn. What choice did Jews have? By 1940, over half of Germany's Jews will be out of Germany. So then how is it that the Holocaust happens if there's so few Jews, right? There's only 200,000 Jews left in Germany. Who are these 6 million Jews? Does anybody know? Right, what happens as the war begins to escalate? Right, we cross over into Poland, we cross over into Russia. In each of those countries, there's 3 million Jews, right? And they don't have this window, right? There's not this window of knowledge, right? They're immediately stuck. They're not able to leave Poland and Russia and Romania and all these other countries. They're confronted with this brutal amount of anti-Semitism. So Reni Hanau, our speaker, Mrs. Hanau, comes from a small town in the middle of Germany named Fulda. At the time that she was living there, I'm sure you will tell us, there were roughly 1,000 Jews, a little over 1,100 Jews. And by 1967, there were only 17 Jews. So this gives you a sense of the impact of the Holocaust on small towns in Germany. One last thing that I just want to mention is this question of what people knew. And so I'd like to bring up the articles from the Staten Island Advance, our local newspaper. What did they report about the Holocaust and about Kristallnacht? And there's a lot to say, but I just want you to see that any idea that the persecution of the Jews was not making front page headlines, you can see that it did. There actually were 30,000 Jews seized by the Nazis. The Advance reported 50,000. They reported speeches where the Jews were linked to communism, which was one of the things that confused people who might have been anti-Semitic and also anti-communist. Notice that Wagner College that very day had a speaker who spoke against isolationism. Remember that Wagner was a German Lutheran college, so it might have been thought that we harbored anti-Semitic feelings. But it seems from evidence, various kinds of evidence, speeches by the college president about Jewish students at Wagner in the 1930s, and events like this where speakers were brought in to speak in favor of intervention, that there was a more complex position on campus in regards to, certainly it was being noticed, right? The events in Nazi Germany were being noticed. And that's what's important as a lesson to all of the students here, is that you can't do anything about a genocide if you don't notice it, right? So pay attention to the speakers that are coming to campus, to the newspaper, to Twitter feeds, right? To all the different ways you can learn about what's going on in the world. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our main speaker to talk about her own personal story of how she survives Kristallnacht.
Well, I didn't have much choice. I was all of 5 years old. But let me go back and tell you a little bit about the world situation at that time. In 1918, the war to end all wars was over. And what happens usually is the losers suffer, which was Germany. And America were winners, but America also suffered. The economy in America became very bad. And economics, as you grow older, you will notice, has a great, great deal to do with what happens in the world. In 1932, when Hitler became into power, it was really a very bad thing of fate. Hitler was a very accomplished artist, and he wanted to go to art school. Unfortunately, he didn't get in, and I think that fact changed the whole world. He did not get in, and he decided that he was going to help Germany get out of their terrible, terrible slump. But there really wasn't any way. And if there's no way of doing something, you blame somebody else. And here were the Jews. Now I'm Jewish, so I may be a little prejudiced, but the Jews were living very quietly in Germany. Some of them were very religious. They worked very hard, and they didn't give anybody any trouble at all, because nobody in Germany would dare to be different. We didn't have this multi-ethnic culture. Everybody tried to be the same. And here were these Jews living there. They were a little bit more successful because family was of utmost importance to them. So they didn't suffer as greatly from the bad economic conditions. So here they were different, and being different makes you pray for bad things. So Hitler decided he had to speak. My father was able to imitate him. He would stand up and scream, the Jews, die Juden, die Juden, and he got the whole country all psyched up about the Jews. The year I was born was about the time he really started, in the early 30s. Laws were passed. Jews were not allowed to slaughter meat. We who observe the kashrut laws, we slaughter meat in a slightly different way. We think it's more humane to do it the way we do it, and that's called kosher. That was the first thing Hitler did. He said, no more kosher meat slaughtering in Germany. And that's the death knell for anybody who wants to be mean to Jews. Then Jews were not allowed to be promoted. If a Jew was a judge, he was demoted. Jews were not allowed to have Gentile employees in 1935. Another thing that was done was stores had to put signs up in some of the cities that they were Jewish-owned. People were told not to go into these stores. Now, Ms. Weintraub mentioned I lived in Fulda. I didn't. I lived right near Fulda, and what happened to me in a town called Reni. And Reni was settled by Jews very, very early. In the 1700s, there were court Jews in Fulda. Court Jews are Jews that live on somebody's land, and they're very well protected and taken care of, and they're sort of upper class. But in the 1700s, the Jews were expelled from this court. I don't know why, and they dispersed into the villages around Fulda. And this village that I'm talking about is called Reni. And in the Hebrew language, the word Reni comes from the word Reno, which is joy. And that was the name of this village. And my father was born there, but he was a teacher. And in Europe, things were very different. There were 3 types of schools: Catholic, Protestant, Jewish. Nobody paid tuition. The government took care of all the schools. My father was the teacher in the Jewish school. He was also the cantor in the synagogue. And he was also the person who taught the kids bar mitzvahs, and he unfortunately would do all the burials. So he had like a 3-point job in this town, but he got there very late. He got there in 1937, and already there were very few Jews. 87 Jews, I think, were there at the time. And at one time, this little village had more Jews living there than Gentiles. But people were fleeing that could. And the only way they had to have papers to flee. And in order to have papers to flee, you had to be given a visa. And how did you get a visa? You got a visa by somebody from America giving you a visa. Now this meant you could come here and you should look for a job, but remember there was unemployment here. You didn't have a job, the person who gave you the visa had to pay your rent and feed you. So people had a very hard time leaving Germany, but they were already beginning, and I think at that time there were only about 500,000 Jews left in Germany. in Germany. There were many, many more Jews in Poland and Austria and all the other European countries. Anyway, this hyping against Jews also was hyping against Jews was also against homosexuals, against gypsies, anybody that was different. And if somebody had been born with a defect, they were put away or they were perhaps killed. Things became very inhumane. And there were signs in all the stores, kaufen nicht bei Juden, which means don't buy from Jews. And then there were pictures all over with showing Jews with long hair and long noses and curly hair. And it was a constant thing against Jews. There was a newspaper called Der Stürmer, and it came out every week with a new anti-Semitic thing about Jews. The children's games, like Candyland, they had a Candyland game, and it was the enemy was always the Jew. It was a constant Jew baiting. So when this Kristallnacht was not a surprise to Jews, they knew that something was happening. Now for me, it was a very unique experience because I lived in this building, which was a synagogue, and it was also the synagogue, the school, and the residence, and there was also a mikveh in this building. And this building was built in the 1860s, and this is where it happened. We went to bed the night of November 9th, and we woke up to stone throwing. And you know something? Stone throwing at that time was very common. In fact, about 6 months before that, we came home from a visit to my grandparents. Our house had been broken into, and I had a doll, and it had been decapitated, and the head of the doll was lying in my crib. And my parents didn't call the police. They moved the crib, they cleaned the house, because the police were the same people that, can you hear me? That were the Nazis. So this stone throwing wasn't exactly a surprise, and we got up. And across from the synagogue, there was a hall. It was probably the biggest place in this little village, and we were asked to gather there. And then all of a sudden, you'd hear fire engines coming up, but they didn't come up like fire engines do today. They came on horses, and they just stood there, and we watched. And all of a sudden, they just took a light and they threw something into the synagogue building, and it went up in flames. And they stood there, and we stood there till it burned to the ground. And when we were finished with it, we were left with just the clothes on our backs. Now this was played up in the German press because some young man had killed an ambassador in Paris, and that was the reason for this. But actually, it was the most well-orchestrated pogrom that had been done in Germany. It was the first pogrom in Germany, and in my humble opinion, I think it was really the beginning of the end for Jews in Europe, the pogrom of 1938. After the fire was put out, we were still standing there. All the men from the age 16 to 60 were asked to come into the center of town. And my father was given a top hat and a broom, and they were led out of the town. At that point, no one knew where they were going. We finally found out where they went. My father was sent to Buchenwald. Now, there are grades in eggs, and there are grades in camps. Buchenwald, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Theresienstadt were concentration camps. They were not death camps. Later on, in the early 40s, death camps were built. But people died in Buchenwald. Jews were extremely patriotic people in Germany. And many of them had fought in World War I on the German side. And they were very proud. I was going to use the German word. They were stolz. Stolz is proud. They were so proud of themselves. They had the Iron Cross. And when they got to Buchenwald or Dachau or Sachsenhausen, wherever they got, they thought, well, I have an Iron Cross. I'm going to tell them I have the Iron Cross. Well, the Iron Cross didn't help. How did they get out? I didn't know it at the time. In fact, I just found this as with doing research. Besides all the synagogue burning down, we had no more place to live. This was November 10th, 1938. By January 1st, 1939, we were banished from Reni, and we had to find someplace else to go out and emigrate. We knew about emigration before this happened. My father was a pretty sophisticated man, and we had tried to come to America, but we had not had such luck because in order to come to America, you had to have a quota number, and our quota number was not ready to be called yet. So we tried other things, and one of the things we tried is to get a visitor's permit to go to any place, but we got it to go to Great Britain. And in June 39, we left for Great Britain. It was interesting. I had grandparents in Germany, and my father felt so bad. He's leaving his old parents in Germany, and one day, he always told me this story. One day, he went over to his father, and he said, listen, Father, I have a child and a wife, and I'm young, and I think we better go. We're leaving next Tuesday to go to England. So he was expecting his father to be hysterical. You know what his father said? I wish you would have left last Tuesday. That's how it was. It was just loaded with bad things to come. Once this Kristallnacht started, bad things came. We lived in Frankfurt for a number of months, and we lived right across the street from the zoo, and I was all of 5 years old. I used to have nightmares about the lions are coming to get me. I'm sure if you would have lived there, some of you might have also. My mother couldn't take me to the zoo. There was a sign outside, Juden unerwünscht. So that was that. So we went to England in 1939. We went to, I think we went to Antwerp, and then we crossed and went to London. And the English were not very receptive to us because we were Germans. But if you looked at our passport, it said stateless. And we also had very different names because in 1937, my mother told me that my name was not Reni anymore. It was now Reni Sarah. And every Jewish man had a new name too. If he was Richard, he was Richard Israel. And if you were asked your name, you better tell them that part. But you know something? I always wondered what happened to that little girl whose mother had called her Sarah. Would she have been Sarah? I always wondered about that. But anyway, I became Reni Sarah Katz. I don't use it anymore. And we got to England, and we had given them all our money. They had demanded exit money. There was no chicanery that they didn't try to do to make it hard for us to leave Germany, even though they wanted us to leave. But they bothered everybody as much as they could. And we got to England, and we had to live on what money that we had left, which wasn't very much. Anyway, we were there for a while, and the war broke out between Germany and England. And here we were, German citizens. So one night they came, and the British, and we had been asked to register as aliens, and some of us were classified as friendly aliens, and some others were classified as enemy aliens, and my parents were classified as enemy aliens. So one night they came and they took my father away. My mother was all of 28 at the time. She decided that she's going to say when they come for her that she was ill, she had a heart condition. Well, it didn't work because the landlady said she told them that she was faking. And then there was me, and they wanted to take me and evacuate me in the country with all the children. And my mother said, no, I'll take my child. So we all went to the Isle of Man, which is a resort near England. And I will say nobody was mistreated, but we were there. My father was on one side of the island with all the men. They slept in horses' stables. And my mother and I were staying in a hotel. And we were in the hotels because during the war they didn't want anybody on the Isle of Man. It was dangerous. So we had to have shades, and we were there for a couple of months. And finally, we got our papers to come to America. Believe it or not, they took us from the Isle of Man to the ship with a police escort because we were such dangerous people. And when I came to America in New York, my mother did me in. The Daily News came to the ship, and here I was a little 7-year-old at the time, or 6-year-old. They wanted to take my picture as the youngest enemy alien, and my mother said no. So here I would have had fame, and I never had it. That's why I go out to speak, because I didn't have that fame. And anyway, and another bit I was told, my uncle said if anybody of my parents would ever touch me, the first thing you do when your parents touches you is there's the police station. You run to the police station. America is a free country. That was my introduction to America, and it was a very bittersweet beginning. Thank God for this country, but it was very, very hard for people to live here in this. It was a very bad economy. Salaries people made were, my mother got a job, I think she made $7 a week, and she had to hide the fact that she made $7 because we lived with relatives where the husband made even less, and she didn't want to. And we worked my parents worked very, very hard to reestablish themselves in America. And I think a lot of people did the same thing. And it was not an easy childhood. And you know, all of my friends were children of refugees. People tend to get together. And a lot of us are only children because our parents fled with Germany, and if they would have had 4 children, I don't know if they could have gotten out. So there was so many repercussions. I could speak to you for hours and hours on them. But anyway, I've got a lot of nerve. I did go back to Germany, and I went back to that town, and I have something to say about it if you want to hear about it. And it was very interesting. What I have to say about it, after the war, we Jews became very hot stuff. There have been books written about Jews. More PhD theses have been written about the Jews of Germany and the Jews of Europe than anywhere. I just brought these because I didn't want to drag heavy books. This is from this little village where there were 87 Jews. And in this book, for instance, my uncle, my father's brother, was killed in 1937 in an automobile accident. There's a picture of his grave in there. He was the last Jew to have been buried in Germany, in that village. Anyway, we went back a number of times. In 2005, I took my son and 2 granddaughters, my husband, we went back. And I talked to a man, and he said to me, we never had anything against you, the Jews. We got along so well. And, you know, there was a bakery right next to my grandparents' house, and that bakery was a matzah bakery, and it baked the matzah for the whole area. And there were jobs given to people from this village, Jews and non-Jews alike. The people had really lived together, and this horrible, horrible genocide started in the country, which, you know, it didn't look that bad. And you know what made me really upset when I got back there? How beautiful Germany was. I wanted to see an ugly, ugly place because I had such ugly, ugly memories of that night and of all the hardship that we faced afterwards. And this, I think, was the beginning of the Holocaust, the pogrom night of November 9th. This following night was a pogrom in Austria, and the same thing happened. And the rest of it you studied in history, and I'm open now to your questions.
We have quite a bit of time for questions, which I had asked Mrs. Hanau to make it more interactive. So please go ahead and you might want to ask her about being a refugee, about her childhood, about her grandparents and anti-Semitism in Germany, anything that would be of interest to you.
Yes.
You know what happened to your husband's parents, that you left them there?
Yes, unfortunately I did. I was a little girl, and my father's father died, and my grandmother was left alone in Germany. I went to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried, and my grandmother was buried there too. My parents never told me this, but somebody else did. And my grandmother was supposed to be deported to Lodz. The day before my grandmother was deported, she and about 17 other people took poison. And my grandmother's, gravestone there are 17 different people, and I said, oh my God, they all died on the same day. I hadn't known about this till somebody told me way after, but that's what happened. They were going to be deported. They stayed in Frankfurt. My grandfather's brother and his wife, I have records, they went to Lodz ghetto, and then they went further east to the camps. Interestingly, the camps were not in Germany. They were in Poland, Czechoslovakia, which I thought was fascinating for somebody who hates the Jew. Why don't they have these camps in Germany? But they didn't. Perhaps there were more Jews in those countries. That may have been the reason.
Well, and there was still a degree of secrecy and a desire to have, they could play on German Nazi prejudices both against Jews and against foreigners, right? Actually, we have stories of Germans having a harder time killing Jews when they spoke German back to them rather than Polish or Russian. There were like triple stereotypes about Russian Jews because Russia had been associated in Nazi propaganda with communism. So it played on Germans who were anti-communist rather than necessarily anti-Semitic or who were both. So, I mean, this is one of the things that's so important to think about in terms of persecution and stereotypes.
I forgot something.
Yes.
When I prepared to come to you, I made myself a list. Why do I want to talk to these kids? Why do I want to talk to people? And here is what I don't like to speak with text, but I think you should speak much better when you speak extemporaneously. Anyway, this is what I wanted to read to you. Remember, never forget this horrific event. That was the beginning of the Holocaust. Let's not forget that 6 million innocent Jewish martyrs just because they were born Jews and no other reason. Honor the memories of those courageous resistors who dared to do what they left. And there were many people who hid Jewish children, and there were people that did the right thing. Listen to the survivors tell their poignant stories. Appreciate the their heroism and hopes to continue what was left of their lives. People came here, had lost 5 children, remarried and started all over, never talked about the Holocaust till they were settled, and then finally in their old age, maybe some of them talked. Teach everyone about the Shoah as part of their human heritage. Genocide must be abolished forever. Teach young children or young people to stand up for injustices and become activists for making the world a better place for everyone. Teach and appreciate the rights of everyone to have the right of free expression and the right to live a peaceful life according to their own needs. And this is very important to me, this last one. Be thankful to live in the United States, in the country, the only country in the world where opportunities are there for all citizens, and to live and prosper in peace. And I just want to end with God bless America.
A few other questions? Yes.
Tell me what happened to your father in Buchenwald and how did he get out?
Okay. My father was in Buchenwald for 4 weeks. My mother went running around every day to different places. The reason we got to England is very interesting. My father was also a shofet. You know what a shofet is? That's a person that does ritual slaughtering. And in Germany and in America, you are not allowed to eat the oxtails. In England, it's kosher to eat oxtails. And the reason they're not allowed to eat them in America, it takes an awful lot of work to devein the oxtail. My father got from England, somebody gave him some kind of a paper to allow him to come to England to learn how to devein oxtail. That's how we got to England. I don't think he ever learned how to do it. But I did bring home, when I went to London, Bloom's oxtail soup in memory of that. That's how, and the people had all kinds of ways to get out. But you know something? They took all our money away, all our savings, all our silver, all these things we had to give. There was many, many different taxes that Jews had to pay, exit visa, all kinds of things. But he got out after 4 weeks. But my mother's father had a very good friend. He happened to not look like I do. He was blonde. And he lived in another town. And his mayor was a very nice friend of his. And he said to my grandfather, I'm going to tell you something. Just stay in your house. Do me a favor. And he did. And then all of a sudden he decided to go out, and a Jewish woman came and talked to him, my husband, and they grabbed him and they brought him to Buchenwald. Well, he was such a proud man with that Iron Cross that he had won in World War I, where he left his wife with 4 kids at home and was fighting for the Germans in Poison, wherever. And my father said he didn't even get up online to get the food. If my father hadn't been there, he would have starved to death. People were killed for crazy reasons. One of my father's friends was killed because Jews were not allowed to have radios, and he had a radio and they got hold of him. That was the end of it. I mean, it was an unbelievable, horrible time to live in Germany. Any other questions? Yes.
What did your father and your mother do in America?
My father was very observant. He was an observant Jew. He couldn't get a job. And he went door to door selling. And that's how my mother learned how to make gloves by hand. Lots of German Jews. People did that. It was like and then other people did what they called homework. People worked very, very hard until they were able to establish themselves. But in 1953, under the Adenauer, the people who were from Germany were able to get restitution. And my father got all his back pay from 1938 to 53. And then he got his pension. I mean, things were better, but it was pretty hard. And for me to go to City College, picture that as somebody here going to Mount Holyoke. Any other questions?
Julia.
Hi. First of all, I just want to say thank you for coming in today and sharing your story. How long did it take for you to start telling your story? Because I know there's a lot of survivors that struggle with that. Personally, my grandma still struggles telling her story.
Well, you were talking about the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Well, in 1997, when the Museum of Jewish Heritage opened, I was there with a hard hat before the building was finished. And in fact, on the first floor, there's a picture of my father. I gave them an artifact, which was a book that my father used to teach boys how to be bar mitzvah, to make a few extra dollars. And that book and his picture is on the first floor. It's right as you come in. I was a gallery educator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and that's when I really started talking about it. I was a teacher, and I retired in 91, and this came up in 97. But before that, during my retirement, I taught English as a second language to Russian immigrants.
Okay, maybe one last question. Anyone have a last question? Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, wait, did you have a question? Go ahead.
What are you feeling today about Germany?
Well, in 2010, anyway, when I told you I went to Germany, I had a friend who was a real Frankfurter, and by that he was born and bred in Frankfurt, and people who are from Frankfurt, they even speak German differently. For instance, the German word for bag is Tüte, and the Frankfurt word for bag is Dutt. Anyway, he said to me, Reni, write a letter to Frankfurt. You lived there. So I did. And I got a lovely, lovely letter back from Frankfurt. And they said, sorry, we don't want you. You weren't born in Frankfurt. In 2009, I get a letter from Frankfurt inviting me to come back because they were running out of people, because as people became older, they didn't want to travel. So I said, why not? And it was a very, very interesting trip. There was nothing that they could do that they didn't do, except I found one thing that irritated me was it was a little difficult to get kosher food. But most of the people, it didn't bother most of the people. And it was a very interesting, because young people are trying so hard to get rid of that image, and they're working very, very hard. I met a man who came from my father's area, and he was a high school teacher, and he had opened up on his own a museum of the Holocaust. And in the high school on the top floor, he had a complete Holocaust museum. He knew everything about my father. He's on the internet. It's an amazing thing. The younger German people are trying very hard to kill that image. I hope and I pray that they are sincere. In fact, I said to this man, I hope I didn't step on his feet. I said, are your parents still alive? And he said, yes. I said, well, I hope they're really proud of the good work you do. And I thought you could take that any way you want to. But that was what I said to him. But he was amazing. He took me around. He was really a good person. His wife was studying to be a minister. And the young people are really, really trying. But the funniest thing was they took me to a school. And at that school, there were teenagers. And you know something? I've been to so many schools giving this talk. The kids in Germany asked me the exact same question, and I have to tell you what that was. The girl said, you're married. When did you meet your husband? And I got that in the high schools in New York, and I got it in the high school in Germany. It was very funny. And the kids were great. And the name of the school that I went to was the Martin Buber School.
So I just wanted to make two closing comments and then two very quick announcements. First, I really hope that you see from Mrs. Hanau's story how the world was watching, and Germans were watching as the events of Kristallnacht happened, and yet there was no effort to stop the Nazis, and in fact, it only escalated from here to ghettos, to mass slaughter one-on-one, to gas vans, and finally to concentration camps. So I think that is one very important lesson of Kristallnacht, what happened and what didn't happen. And then that one of the things that absolutely does happen is that Jews leave. And this very much is against this image in the concentration camps of the Jews being led to slaughter, of not being strong, not resisting. There was tremendous resistance. Picking up your family and moving to a new place, getting out of the picture, was a kind of resistance. I had asked Mrs. Hanau, do you consider yourself a survivor? And you said, a refugee.
I'm not a survivor, I'm a refugee. I got out before it got bad.
But I think you could also make an argument for her family as being part of the resistance. To leave, to get out from this very dangerous situation is a kind of resistance. The Nazis didn't win. Her family is one of those that survived and brought this wonderful German Jewish culture to the United States. So this is one of the things that I think that you should be thinking about. And as you go on to learn more about this, whether in Holocaust classes, there's a class in the spring called the Economics of Genocide. My Holocaust class will be a year from this spring. But next Tuesday are two events. Holiday Lunch and Learn from the Chai Society on Hanukkah, taught by our own political scientist and Rabbi Abe Unger. That's going to be in the Reynolds House Library at noon, and I think she wants you to sign up if you're interested. This is especially for the students, but also anyone else. And then next Tuesday night, an event with a college in Israel. We now have a special partnership with Kibbutzim College in Israel, and they are going to be joining us for a conversation about educational leadership for a humane culture in a globalizing world. And the keynote speaker is Carolyn Musil, who's a very prominent American educator, but all the commentators will be from Kibbutzim College of Education in Tel Aviv. And that's next Tuesday from 5 to 7 in Spiro 2. And again, that's both for students and for community members. So I invite you to continue to be a part of this, the struggle to remember, to stand up for human rights and fight injustice, and to do everything you can to be an informed citizen of the world in order to make good choices. So thank you again to our speaker. And I invite you to come up and ask further questions as well. Thank you. Thank you so much.